Well, Typhoon Halong sparking disastrous and deadly flooding in Alaska. This weekend, floodwaters swept through coastal communities in the western part of the state. And as of this morning, several dozen people have had to be rescued. But tragically, one person has died. Two others remain missing.
Yeah, still shocking video, even as we look at it on this Wednesday from out of the weekend. Alaska DOT saying a combined 50 airports and roads were damaged as a result of this. Access and communication to these remote communities severed in some cases, and more than 1,000 people taking shelter across the region. As we know, crews are rolling in to help in the response and recover. We have Taylar Sausen, national spokesperson of the American Red Cross, joining us now. And Taylar, I think what's so wild, I saw the number 50 for airports and roads, but was reminded that a lot of these communities are so remote, they rely on these airports for small planes to navigate back and forth. And without that accessibility, it really puts them at even greater risk in recovering from this.
Yeah, so about 90% of Alaska is actually inaccessible by road. So these communities that have been impacted are part of that 90%. There is no access to these villages except via plane and sometimes boat, depending on if, there are river access to these villages. So this has made the disaster response particularly difficult for a number of days. And during this storm, these gravel airstrips that they have that serve as an airport were underwater. And so that made access both in and out of these remote areas impossible. So right now, the American Red Cross is working with our state, our local, and our tribal governments to provide as much disaster assistance as we can. Right now, we have about half a dozen volunteers are staged in one of the hub communities of Bethel. That is the closest, less remote communities to the major villages that have been impacted. You're seeing photos of villages of Kipnuk and Quingilingok. Those are the ones that are, we're seeing the most significant impact. And the state and the tribal governments have evacuated a number of people out of those villages to these hub villages where we're able to provide more of a wraparound support.
How has communication been, Taylar? Because given the remote nature of these villages, to know that some of these communities need help, word has to get out. Has that been affected with these floods? I only mention that because the winds associated with the remnants here, they were 80, 90 miles an hour. So any sort of towers that may have been there, I'm sure that some were damaged.
Absolutely. That was a major concern, and there was very limited connectivity, if any connectivity at all, to many of the villages, both during and immediately after the storm. There are some areas in Alaska where we have yet to hear what the storm impacts were because we have no connectivity with them. So it really is a challenge for disaster responders to begin to even evaluate the level of damage that we're seeing, across the more than 40 communities that have been impacted by this storm.
It is so wild. And in speaking to the remoteness, because it is such a big part of the story, right? And remains a part of the story because of the difficulties in getting to these people. These communities, because they're more remote, depend on themselves for hunting, for fishing, gathering their food, the supplies that they're going to need to get through the winter months. And it is starting to drop in temperature, especially in western Alaska. And we're only going to get colder as we get further into the season. So I guess, is it that race against the clock as well to make sure you're getting to those people that need it most as things start to change? And then I guess the long-term help and what that could look like.
It is a major concern for us because a lot of these communities rely on their traditional practices of subsistence lifestyle, meaning they hunt, fish, and gather all of the food and the supplies that they would need in the summer months in order to be able to survive the winter months. We saw something very similar in 2022 during Typhoon Merbok, and a number of these communities were impacted once again by the remnants of Typhoon Halong. So what we at the Red Cross have done, which has never been done before in the Red Cross, what we did during Typhoon Merbok was we actually provided some of the materials that these individuals would need in order to be able to have have that subsistence lifestyle back. So if their freezers were broken where they were storing their frozen fish, we were providing freezers, we were providing vacuum sealers so that they could, very quickly gather more supplies and have the materials that they need in order to keep those safely. Fish drying racks were a number of things that we provided, which is not our typical disaster response material. Normally we're giving individuals cleanup kits, shovels, mops, rakes, things like that, but that's not what these rural communities need. And in order to support these disasters, like tropical storms, like floods, and countless other crises, it's really important that we rely on the generosity of our donors and support through the American Red Cross Disaster Relief. So if anybody out in the public is wanting to help support this operations and operations like this, I would encourage them to visit redcross.org or call 1-800-RED-CROSS and help us with your support.
It does speak to knowing the people that you're serving and knowing what those needs are, because each disaster, while there is this understanding that a disaster brings so much tragedy, there are unique needs that we all have. So understanding what it's like in those Western communities of Alaska, vital.
Yeah, and those donations go a long way, right? It's not so much about getting help out there. It's about providing the finances to support the Red Cross to be able to provide that support. Well, we appreciate you joining us here on Weather Command and continuing the story as we watch recovery efforts out of Western Alaska. Taylar Sausen, National Spokesperson of the American Red Cross. Appreciate it.